Both sides will commit more troops to the action, and with the principal point of focus being to guide on the sound of the guns. The units will move into action, and largely as a result of that guiding on the sound of the guns, the battle line begins to flow southward. And as some of you all have heard in the two other programs I have already done this morning, this extension of the general battle line ever further southwestward during the course of the day does nothing towards achieving Bragg's desire of getting his army in between the Union Army and Chattanooga, and then attacking the Union Army and driving it southwestward to hopefully crush it against the wall of Lookout Mountain. And this fighting with Cheatham's division just is an illustration of that continuing flow southward of the battle action that day, and away from the Union left flank. So, any questions or observations at this point? Okay, we're going to move just a short distance for our first stop. Basically would have had it as individuals. However, in many cases, entire units are being captured, or significant portions of units are being captured, and so the exchanges then, just simply because it is easier, essentially in many cases become unit exchanges. And even more than that, it is exchanges of soldiers captured at a certain time or place, or within a certain time bracket. Because the way the system was supposed to work was that when one side or the other captured an enemy soldier, that soldier was supposed to be taken possession of. We'll use the Union Army capturing a Confederate soldier. The Union Army captures a Confederate soldier, whether it's in battle or maybe it's a Confederate soldier who's home on medical furlough, and the Union Army moves into that area and they take possession of him. What is supposed to happen is that he is supposed to be processed up through Union channels and held on to, and then a parole issued to him where he promises not to fight until properly exchanged. And then he is to be sent to one of two points of agreed upon exchange for prisoners. One of them was on the Mississippi River, and the other was on the James River downstream of Richmond, Virginia. And so the Union Army would then be expected to hold on to that Confederate soldier, process him through the system, and transport him to one of those two exchange points where he would then be handed back over to the Confederate side. Well, that all sounds nice and neat on paper, but what are some of the factors in actually making that happen? There's transportation, you got to feed them, you got to care for them, and what very quickly began to happen, particularly with a lot of individual captures, is that both sides began to simply issue paroles to them and turn them loose, send them back into to the other side's lines. And this creates some problems, including some instances where both sides believe that some of their soldiers are engineering opportunities of being captured so that they can then be paroled and have a vacation home. The system never quite functioned exactly the way it was supposed to. But in all of this, there would be record keeping, and periodically the Union Commissioner of Exchange would meet the Confederate Commissioner of Exchange on a boat in the James River, and they would sit down and they'd say, since we last met, I have captured 1 of your generals, 5 of your colonels, 7 of your lieutenant colonels, 47 majors, 103 captains, and Rattlewall is often say, let's trade. A captain is worth so many privates, a sergeant is worth so many privates, and they would work out this system, and typically, as I said, what they wound up doing was saying, everybody captured on or before this date is now declared exchanged. But that system only functioned for at most 1 year, from the summer of 1862 to late spring of 1863. It collapsed in the late spring of 1863 because in late May of 1863, the United States announced
that we would the black units, the
That's right.
African American, we started raising the colored units, and then they announced that they wouldn't take them prisoner, basically.
Right. Well, they African Americans that the Confederates captured in Union uniform would be returned to a condition of servitude, regardless of whether or not they were a former slave that escaped to the Union lines, or a free black, or from the North, or whatever. And this was the real point of contention. You know what was what the Confederates were going to do to the white officers?
They were going to be executed.
Well, they were going to be tried for servile insurrection, promoting servile insurrection, and the only penalty for that crime in any of the Confederate states was death, execution. And so the parole and exchange system begins to break down in late May of 1863. And it is after that collapse in the summer of 1863 when both sides start having large numbers of enemy soldiers in their hands as prisoners for a long time, and they have to start worrying about what they're going to do with them. And most Civil War prison camps only come into being after June of 1863. Andersonville is not even created until February of 1864. As the number of Union soldiers the Confederates are holding on to increases, so much so that the population of around Richmond becomes a potential threat to the Confederate possession of Richmond. Now, I got to discussing this in answer to a question, but it does have a connection to the Battle of Chickamauga here. Union soldiers captured by the Confederates here at Chickamauga are going to get a railroad tour of the Confederate States of America. They will be marched from here to the railroad, sent down to Atlanta, and then all the way to Richmond, Virginia. The officers to Libby Prison, the enlisted soldiers to Belle Isle. And in early 1864, as the Union prison population in Richmond expanded, and there was even a Union effort to free some of those prisoners, the Dahlgren Raid, the Confederates decide to ship some of them out, and that is when they look for a new prison camp location. And they find what they think is a viable place near Anderson Depot, just north of Americus, Georgia. Confederate soldiers captured here will be sent to Camp Morton, Camp Chase, Camp Douglas, Rock Island, and most of the soldiers captured in the Battle of Chickamauga will wind up in enemy hands until the end of the war, if they did not die first in prison. There are even Union soldiers captured at Chickamauga on board the vessel that is our nation's worst maritime disaster, the Sultana, where almost 1,800 former Union prisoners drown in the Mississippi rivers. So it's related, but now back to midday, early afternoon, September of the Alexander Bridge Road, when Cheatham's division, which had crossed the creek down at Dalton's Ford, early in the morning, and then initially been staged to potentially participate in what Bragg still thought would be the assault on the Union left flank where it had been Lee and Gordon's Mill. From there, they were then marched northward in late morning, and Cheatham deployed his large division of 5 brigades with Jackson's, Smith's, and Wright's brigades in the first line, and Maney and Straw's brigades in a second line. The right flank of the division essentially on Alexander Bridge Road, and when the division advances, it will be moving northwestward, essentially on the same axis of Alexander Bridge Road, but to the southwest or left of Alexander Bridge Road. And across the ground where we are right here is going to be where Jackson and Maney's brigades sweep. First Jackson and then Maney. What we're primarily going to look at is the next pair of brigades and the action that takes place in the Brock Field area there. All right. So now, as we walk from here, we will walk across the front of Jackson's brigade, and then into the front of Preston Smith's brigade. They're right there, the right of Cheatham's division, and they eventually will push on that line that I was scribing earlier with the monuments. That line then runs right along this corner up in this direction. So they'll push. Well, this would be the line of monuments, and they push right through here. So. Okay. We are in the northern end of what is identified today as Brock Field. Now, in general, on the 5,300 acres of the battlefield park that we have today, the pattern of fields and forest is close to what it was at the time of the battle. In general, where you see a field on the Chickamauga battlefield today, there was a field at the time. And in general, where you see forest, there was forest at the time. But sometimes there are variations. Sometimes the size of the field is a little too large or a little bit too small. There are also a few instances where fields are either entirely absent or are dramatically smaller. And that is actually the case here at Brock Field. And today, as you look at this Brock Field, basically what you are seeing is what is this area on the map, where you see the symbols for Hazen's brigade and Smith's brigade. But at the time of the Civil War, the Brock Field was much larger. It extended much further to the south. This white area, across which the left of Smith and Wright's brigade would have swept in their advance, this was part of Brock Field as well. There was only a relatively thin strip of trees, in part because of an arm of a wet weather drainage that separated this field from the other field. If we were here in September of 1863, we would be able to look through that thin strip of trees there and into this much larger Brock Field. There would be more open ground here, or at least the perception. There was both the reality and the perception of more open ground. And then there is this area on the map. I'll hold it up so you can see a little bit better. The area right here. Now, a couple of you all, I think, have been with me at one time or another when we have discussed this. But anybody want to guess what this might indicate? Not cedar glade. Stumps is getting close, but felled trees, or at least the tops from trees that had been felled. The Brock family was in the process of clearing an additional area. Now, this was being done a little bit differently. Typically, how a farmer cleared a forested area for a field was having identified a given area as likely to be good ground for crops, would go within that area and with an axe, about 3 feet off of the ground, because that's the comfortable height at which to swing the axe, you would cut into the tree. You would cut through the bark and the first first couple of layers of the tree, most specifically what's known as the cambium layer, which is where nutrients and water are either carried up or down the tree. And you would cut through that, and you would kill the tree thereby. And in fact, for the first years of a farmer farming a new piece of ground, there would be dead standing trees in the field. And they would literally just farm around the dead standing trees. And in the wintertime, they might gather up the limbs and branches that have fallen and pile them up around the base of the tree and set them on fire and hopefully burn the tree down, encourage the more rapid decomposition of that tree. And one of these areas that was had been girdled, that cutting that ring was called girdling. One of these areas where you had a large number of trees that had been girdled as part of this clearing process would be known as a deadening, where the trees had been killed as part of the clearing. Farmers did not have the labor or the machinery to be able to actually clear the trees, get rid of the top and the trunk and the stump and all. They had to let nature and time do that more often, but they would encourage it by various means. And so in most instances, they were not cutting the trees down in clearing. Now, if there was a good tree that would make a good log for a cabin or a barn, or a good log to be split into fence rails, they might cut that one down and use that log. But most trees that were identified needing to go to create a farm field were simply girdled. And you can even see there are a number of Civil War photographs, even a couple on this battlefield, where you can see girdled trees in the picture. And also, as I said, for many years initially, in a new field, there would be dead standing trees. In fact, in the Brock Field, there were several, and in the course of the action, some brush fires got started, and they around the base of those dead standing trees was brush, which caught on fire. And some of you all know one of the ways that trees rot is by the inside out. They become hollow, and there would be an opening at the top. That fire might get into the bottom, and you've got this hollow tube sticking up into the air. It's very much like a chimney. Yep. And it would draw it up through. And in fact, in some of the fighting that went right to dark here at the Brock Field, it was said that some of these dead standing trunks of trees, hollow trunks of trees, were blowing embers out of the top, and it looked like Roman candles. But this area to the north is being handled differently. The trees are being cut down, and the tops cut free. Why? Well, yeah, the sawmill close by. That's probably why. We don't know for certain. We'll probably never know. But less than a mile down the road from here is a sawmill. And so maybe the Brocks have seen an opportunity to make a little money by selling the saw logs off of a piece of their property, and thereby beginning to clear a larger area. Well, when Richard Johnson's troops move forward on the north side of the road here, they move into this area of felled trees. It's a tangle. It actually makes it difficult for them to move through. As they drove Confederate troops back, and then in turn were driven back by Confederate troops, where did Union troops withdraw into? That zone of felled trees. In fact, as they did, what do you think some Union soldiers began to use these felled treetops as? Cover, that's right. And Confederates, including in Jackson's brigade and Maney's brigade, say that they drove the Federals into their works, or into their breastworks, or into their log works. The Federals are going to build lots of field fortifications here on the night of the 19th, early morning hours of the 20th. But they aren't building any really here on this part of the battlefield. What these Federal soldiers have withdrawn into is this zone of felled treetops, which they then begin to use for cover, and Confederates perceive as field fortifications. So there would have been more open ground here at the time. In reality and by perception, a field more than twice the size of, the Brock Field was more than twice the size of what you see here today, extending to the south, and we had this zone of felled trees to the north. Now, there are probably lots of scraggly trees growing amongst those tops. It's still described as being wooded, but there would have been a greater sense of open ground here. This next Union division coming into to action is the division commanded by John Macaulay Palmer, a prominent Illinois politician and turned soldier. He brings his division of Tom Crittenden's 21st Corps onto the battlefield. They had been shifted on the evening of September the 18th from the Glass Mill area below Lee and Gordon's Mill to just north of Lee and Gordon's Mill. And then on the morning of the 19th, one of his brigades under William Gross was ordered to make a reconnaissance up the Lafayette Road to establish contact with Thomas, who's marched overnight to Kelly Field. Gross's brigade then marched partway back to the south, actually marched out this Brotherton Road a short distance, some of the, or at least the skirmish line, out this far to the Brock Field, before Gross was recalled and ordered back to Lee and Gordon's Mill. But only a few minutes later, Palmer was ordered to bring his entire division up from Lee and Gordon's Mill. And he marched up the Lafayette Road from Lee and Gordon's Mill, and then turned westward, marched over by the Widow Glens, where Rosecrans has established his headquarters, and as he passed there, he went into Rosecrans' headquarters at the Widow Glens and consulted Rosecrans for any guidance about his expected participation in the battle. While for many of you all, earlier today we talked about communications problems and the passing of intelligence within the Confederate Army, how in particular Nathan Bedford Forrest does not accurately relate the situation in his sector to Braxton Bragg. Within the Union Army, there is much better communication. And as this fight has grown south into this sector where Johnson's division is engaged, various commanders have been communicating to William Stark Rosecrans. And while Rosecrans at the Widow Glens, which is where the Water Brigade Monument is today, while Rosecrans could not see any of the battlefield, he is getting intelligence about the course of the action. And part of that intelligence has been description of what has happened to Absalom Baird's division and even somewhat Richard Johnson's division. As they had marched eastward from the Lafayette Road to become engaged in the action, their right flank, or southernmost flank on the battlefield, had become threatened. And that had really happened to Absalom Baird's division. As a result of this, Rosecrans is going to communicate to Palmer that perhaps an alternate disposition of his 3-brigade division would be appropriate on the battlefield. The Union Army is fully using the new United States Army infantry tactics known as Casey's Tactics, written by a board of officers under Brigadier General Silas Casey. And in Casey's Tactics, the preferred formation for a division-size element was to deploy, like Johnson, with 2 brigades up, Villick and Baldwin here on this map, and 1 brigade in reserve, or in a second line, or back, Dodge's brigade. This more compact formation meant that the units were closer together, better command and control for that division commander, as opposed to all 3 of the brigades stretched out on line, and this 3rd brigade in a second line allowed the division commander some, as we would describe it today, versatility or flexibility, some ability to meet circumstances as they might develop. Now, Casey's Tactics also calls for, within a brigade, to have 2 of the regiments in the front line, 2 of the regiments in the second line, and actually the regiments in the reserve brigade would be in a more compact movement formation called column of division. This starts to give depth, versatility, flexibility to the Union formation. But it presents a relatively narrow front based on the larger Confederate front. And in this case, the right flank is potentially threatened. And what Rosecrans suggested to Palmer was, instead of going into action with 2 brigades up and 1 brigade back, go in echelon. What this is going to mean is, let's see, can I have 3 volunteers? Anybody want to volunteer for the Union Army? Okay, thank you. All right, sir, I'm going to make you William B. Hazen's brigade, okay? So I need you to actually face in this direction. You are Hazen's brigade, and so I'm going to make you Cruft's brigade. I'm going to get you to stand right here. And then I'm going to make you Gross's brigade, and you can stand right there. Now, this would be your standard Casey's textbook formation. 2 brigades up, 1 brigade back. But what Rosecrans has suggested to Palmer is go in echelon. So instead, as they march up, and I'll get you to take 3 steps back for just a second, as they go in, as they deploy to go into action out on the Lafayette Road in the area of the Poe Farm, Hazen's brigade is put on the left front of the division formation. Cruft's brigade is put to his right rear, stair-stepped off to the south, in this case, southwest. And then Gross's brigade, be careful of the hole, Gross's brigade is stair-stepped to the right-left of Cruft's brigade. And the idea is that as they march eastward now and become engaged, if Hazen's brigade encounters a sizable body of Confederates which begins to threaten his flank, even though he might shift his 2 rear regiments into the front line to deal with that threat, Cruft could immediately come up and protect Hazen's right flank. And if the Confederates overlap Cruft and threaten his right flank, Gross could come up and protect Cruft's right flank. And that formation is how Palmer will actually commit his division. So, did you have a question, sir?
Distance between?
A couple of 100 yards. In the woods here, probably minimum of 200 yards. In a lot of other circumstances where there would be more open ground, maybe as much as 400 yards. Because you had to have what they called deploying distance, space to potentially allow Hazen to maneuver his 2 regiments on the line, Cruft to maneuver his regiments potentially into line as well. So, but in the wooded environment here, probably just 200 yards, maybe 300 yards at most. and they'd have their skirmishers out in front. I'm sorry.
When you attack an echelon like that, these two guys, how do they know when to move?
Well, that's a very good question. And this is an illustration of what this type of formation requires, which is very good coordination, very good communication. That means that the division staff has to be communicating all the time with the 3 brigade commanders, and the staffs of the brigades need to be communicating between one another all the time as well, so that if they decide that the appropriate interval is 300 yards, that when Hazen moves, Cruft, as soon as Hazen makes, say, 250 yards distance, then Cruft can start giving the orders that are going to put his troops in motion.
Is he considered in command?
In this particular case, yes, they are guiding on Hazen's brigade. They're guiding on the left. Now you could do it. You could reverse this the other way. You could guide on the right. But in this case, they are guiding on Hazen. And Hazen, while he doesn't know exactly where Johnson's right flank is, he knows he's moving towards that right flank.
When you move an echelon like that, do these 2 brigades have skirmishers in front of them?
Yes, yes. And you also want to make sure that the skirmishers at Hazen are coordinating with Cruft, so you don't have a gap in the skirmish line there, and the same between Cruft and Gross. So,
were a majority of these troops under Palmer, were they experienced veterans that could
yes.
do something like this?
Yes.
Okay.
They have fought at Stones River 9 months before. Hazen's brigade is there's been some reorganization, some shifting of units, but Hazen's brigade is the Union brigade that held the 4 acres of trees known as the Round Forest, or what becomes called Hell's Half Acre. And while Cruft's brigade and Gross's brigade, which at Stones River was under somebody else, while they had a little harder time at Stones River, they have had combat experience as well.
Is this something that the division would try to work on coordinating in between battles?
Right, and now Casey's tactics was officially adopted by the United States Army in August of 1862. Copies of it began to be distributed to the Army or armies at that time, and even before Don Carlos Buell left command of the Army of the Ohio after Perryville, and in late October, Buell had begun efforts to implement Casey's tactics within that army, which will soon become the Army of the Cumberland. And Rosecrans, as soon as he took command, even at Stones River, the Army is beginning to fight in Casey's tactics. And after Stones River in early 1863, they drilled and practiced with this Casey's tactics formation extensively. So
Staff, they would also work their parts about coordinating.
right, that's right. Yeah, there were division-sized drills in the spring of 1863 where they went through all of these different formations. Casey's Tactics is a big, thick book about like this. If you ever have insomnia, get Casey's Tactics and start trying to read it. So.
Is this substantially different than Hardy's?
Well, see, Hardy's Tactics, there's actually a misunderstanding about Hardy's Tactics. The U.S. Infantry Tactical Manual before the Civil War, well, let's say in 1850, was a 3-volume work published by Winfield Scott in 1830, Scott's Tactics. And Volume 1 of Scott, Hardy, and Casey, Volume 1 is School of the Soldier, and School of the Company. That's the only thing that's in Volume 1. So that's all of how a soldier stands, how he makes left and right faces, how he loads and fires the musket, and then how the company is formed and how it moves from one formation to another. Volume 2 of Hardy's Tactics, Scott's Tactics, or I'm sorry, I've got to do them in order. Scott's Tactics, Hardy's Tactics, and Casey's Tactics is School of the Battalion, or the regiment, as we would think of it. They formerly, a regiment was a battalion. Then evolutions of brigade, division, corps is volume 3 in Scott's Tactics and Casey's Tactics. Notice I didn't say in Hardy's Tactics, because all Hardy was tasked with doing was coming up with a manual for the new, shorter infantry rifle. The model 1855 rifle in that system of arms that the United States Army adopted in 1855. There was a musket-length arm, but there was also a shorter rifle arm. Go into to the Fuller Gun Collection in the Chickamauga Battlefield Visitor Center. Go to aisle 2, case C, and it's probably going to be Windows 3 or 4. And you will see the row of Model 1855 arms of the United States. The distinctive thing about the Model 55s was, I think you're on it. No. It is the Maynard tape primer. For a number of individuals in this group, you might remember from your childhood the cap gun that you would buy, and you would buy that roll of caps, which had the little bubble of explosive, and in between each little bubble there was a little hole, and you would carefully load that into the compartment of your cap gun, and when you pulled the trigger, it would advance that roll just a little bit, and the hammer would come down on that percussion-sensitive chemical in that little bubble, and you would get the pop, the bang. Well, a guy by the name of Maynard conceived that rather than have to put a copper percussion cap on the cone of the nipple every time to fire your weapon, why not just have a tape of percussion-sensitive chemical, and every time you cock the hammer, it advances it, and then the hammer comes down, explodes that, sends a spark down through the cone or nipple, sets the gun off. Sound like a good idea? Yeah, except in the 1850s. They weren't quite advanced enough to make that happen. The big thing was they couldn't make that tape waterproof at the time. As I recall from my childhood, they still couldn't make that tape waterproof. But the Model 1855s had the Maynard tape primer system on them. It had a little door on the lock plate where you'd put that little roll of percussion-sensitive chemical and feed it out. Well, the Model 1855s had a shorter two-band rifled weapon, similar to the Mississippi rifle, the Model 1841. Well, it's a shorter weapon. It's intended for riflemen who are supposed to be more marksmen, who are supposed to be more light, open troops. And so with this new weapon, the Army said, we need a manual for it. So, William Hardy, you are going to be the president of a board of officers to write a manual. And what Hardy decided to do was simply get the French manual, translate it to English, put his name on it, and submit it. And so all Hardy's tactics are, at the beginning of the Civil War, is a two-volume work for the shorter two-band Model 1855 rifle. Now, because everybody wants to be a rifleman, what was a favorite or a popular pastime or attraction at the late 1850s? The Zouaves. You'd go see drilling contests between your local rifle company and some out-of-town rifle company. Lots of people know about the new Hardy's Tactics and the new rifle, and Hardy's Tactics gets a lot of attention, but it really was only for the new rifle. And the Army realized there are a number of issues with the age of Scott and Hardee's and all of these things, and that's why they convened the Casey's Tactics Board. Now, it gets even more complicated than that when we factor in the Confederates, because what does Hardee do? He joins the Confederate Army. And he thinks that he should get some credit for writing this tactical manual, so he makes some changes to the Hardee's Tactics he wrote for the United States Army to incorporate, once again, the longer musket-length weapon. Has anybody seen the Confederate Living History demonstration today? No? Okay. Oh, all right. Did you notice whether or not the Confederates, when they are loading their weapons, are they loading them by placing the butt between their feet, or are they putting the butt off to the left side of their body?
No, we didn't see them doing that.
Okay. Hardee makes a modification, puts the butt off to the left side, so you have a Confederate Hardee's Tactics. So it's this is all very complex, but it also has some impact on the battlefield. And here at Chickamauga, the Union Army is fighting with Casey's Tactics, which gives Union commanders more ability to react to the changing circumstances on the battlefield. And Palmer does that. He deploys in this echelon formation, and he will come in from the west, advancing through this ground towards the Confederates on the right flank of Johnson's division. And Hazen's brigade will move through this zone of felled trees on the north of the road and will come out here into this field. The little monument right here is a marker to the 9th Indiana Infantry of Hazen's brigade, Colonel Isaac Suman's regiment. You have the 124th Ohio Monument right here that we're looking at the back of. And the larger monument across the field there is the monument to the 41st Ohio, William B. Hazen's regiment at the beginning of the war. And then the other regiment of that brigade, the 6th Kentucky, they don't have a marker out here, but they're a mostly Louisville, Kentucky area German outfit. But Hazen initially moved out here into the field in the formation of 2 regiments up and 2 regiments back. And just as Rosecrans suspected would be the case, when Hazen moves out here into this field with Cheatham's line, Jackson's brigade over there, Preston Smith's brigade attacking here, and Wright's brigade sweeping across what would have then been the bigger part of the Brock Field down there, Hazen's right flank is threatened. And Cruft's brigade will then come up onto line. And because the Confederates still extend beyond Cruft, Cruft actually begins to turn back to the west, and then as the Confederate line continued to overlap the Union line, Gross's brigade comes up, but they wind up turning to face more to the south. And so you wind up with Palmer's division deployed with Hazen facing to the east or southeast, Cruft facing to the southeast or south, and Gross facing basically to the south. And Hazen's brigade, or Palmer's division, winds up essentially fighting on a line marked by the monuments to Hazen's brigade here, and then bending back through Cruft's brigade into the woods, and then Gross's brigade beyond. But he's able to protect the right flank, and then soon Van Cleve's division is going to come up, on Gross's right, Palmer's right, to further protect that. When Hazen moved into this area, he had the advantage of some open ground. Now, I've already described how the Brock Field was larger, by the felled trees to the north and by the field that is entirely grown up there today to the south of us, but the field was actually even larger than that. As you look at that eastern edge of the Brock Field today, you can see that the ground is sloping down. And in a few minutes, when we walk back that way, I will point out to you that in that low ground there is a wet weather drainage, a little creek, a draw. And that field actually continued on the other side of that drainage. And a few of you can probably look down the road and see that the road is sloping down, but then it's going to begin to rise up again. The field actually extended on the other side of that drainage. And to illustrate this, we're going to try to walk over there a little bit in just a minute. So the fight here, there'll be a little bit of seesaw back and forth. Preston Smith's men will come out into the field. They'll take shelter behind some of the fences that were along the edge of the field, and apparently some out in the field itself. As they came out into the field, some of Richard Johnson's troops in the felled timber in the woods to the north, particularly as they began to push Cheatham, Jackson, and Maney back, they're able to put fire into Preston Smith's flank. And this just becomes another one of these midday, early afternoon, kind of back and forth seesaw battles as the line extends further southward. As Hazen's men expend all of their ammunition, John Basil Turchin's brigade of Reynolds' division of Thomas's 14th Corps, another one of the units that has marched much of the night, they arrive, and Turchin will relieve Reynolds on this line, relieve Hazen on this line, so Hazen can go back and resupply with ammunition back on the Lafayette Road at the Poe Field, where the division ammunition train is parked. Questions, observations here?
Are these Tennessee units?
Right, the little markers that you can just barely see sticking above the grass are to the Tennessee regiments in 1st Preston Smith's brigade in this field, and then Otho Strahl's brigade as they come into the field. And in actuality, that line does bend around. There are more markers down there in the woods for those commands as well.
Jim, how much artillery was used there?
Well, Battery F, 1st Ohio Light Artillery, Hazen's battery is with them. They will be firing some. Their small marker and tablet are right over here. They actually have a little bit better chance because there's some open ground here. The battery attached to Turchin's brigade came up and tried to participate in the fight, but all the artillery has a real challenge. Cruft's and Gross's batteries will participate as well. This is just not a good field for the artillery.
Then how long would it typically take a brigade to resupply once they arrived at the ordnance train? Like Boston resupplied and came back, and that surprised me.
Yeah, not a great deal of time.
20 minutes, half an hour?
Well, 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. In this circumstance, the ordnance officer would have taken the opportunity to have a mechanism by which to account for all those things he could not account for by saying that it was expended in battle. And so some of the niceties of record keeping that they would be expected to maintain in camp would not be pursued. The wooden packing boxes that the ammunition came in, those wooden boxes were accountable property. And so when that ordnance officer signed for 10 additional boxes of ammunition, he was signing for the wooden boxes too, and he was expected to turn them back in. But now he's in battle, he can write them off, expended in battle. And so that box would have just been broken open, maybe by the simplest means possible.
Throw it on the ground.
Gravity. Throw it on the ground. And break that box open. And the ammunition within that box is already in packages of 10 cartridges. And you could very quickly then hand all the soldiers in your company 1, 2, 3, 4 more packs of cartridges. Then slip that piece of white cotton twine off of the packet, unfold the paper, drop 10 of them in the open top slots of your cartridge box in one tin, 10 more in the other tin, and maybe unwrap the others and put them in the bottom slot, or keep that pack wrapped together in the bottom slot, or just simply stick those packs of 10 into your uniform somewhere. So, but there's a little hazard to doing that, because they're wrapped in paper and they're paper cartridges, and if you're sweaty, paper is hygroscopic, but you know, there are plenty of examples. Most of these units go into action with about 60 rounds of ammunition, 40 in the cartridge box and 20 more in their pockets.
Well, that's what I was
okay.
Well, the question from Brock Field from last night, you said they were issued 60 rounds. I wonder if they already had 20 or 30 rounds. Would they be still issued 60 rounds?
Well, it depends. The reference last night was they were issued an additional 60 rounds on top of the 40 that they already had in their cartridge box. So I forget which account that was I was reading last night. Actually, it was 2 accounts that mentioned that. There's both Scribner's Brigade, yes. So when Scribner's men went into action here in Winfrey Field on the morning of September the 19th, they have 100 rounds of ammunition on their persons.
I mean, would they put it in their knapsack?
Well, probably not their knapsack, because they would anticipate being ordered to drop their knapsack. Maybe in their haversack, most probably just simply in their coat pocket.
Jim, wait.
Yes, it is. Yes.
You didn't have enough ammo.
That they had to use, 60 rounds. Are they not fouling out by 60 rounds?
Oh yes, the weapons will potentially foul, and so you might have to sacrifice a little bit of the water in your canteen to put into the barrel and agitate with the ramrod to try to break some of that stuff free. So yes, the potential of the weapon fouling is very great. So,
How effective was the Confederates resupplying ammo?
The Confederates really don't have a problem with resupply. They have ordnance trains, and so they're able to get boxes of ammunition up close to the line for either the troops to come back to, or to go up to the troops. In fact, in Cheatham's division, Cheatham's ordnance officer is his brother John, and John was directed to cross the division ordnance train at Alexander Bridge, and he did, and he parked it in the fields down at Alexander Bridge on this side of the creek. And as the division went into action, John anticipated that they were likely to suffer some casualties, and he was hoping that they would drive the Federals off some of the ground. And as the battle unfolds, what is the ground going to begin to be covered with? Discarded equipment, in particular, discarded weapons. And John actually had a couple of wagons of ammunition unloaded, and he sent the empty wagons in immediately behind Maney's and Stroll's brigade with a detail to begin immediately picking up dropped weapons. Yeah, but first he wants to save the good weapons that his men have that they might be dropping. He also is thinking he might get better quality weapons from Union casualties on the field. So, and they also send wagon loads of ammunition forward as well. So.
This is from a little bit earlier sector of time in the battle, but when Johnson originally came up, was he able to devastate Lytle's flank?
Well, actually, who's going to really do Lytle in is Cruxton's brigade.
Okay.
But Johnson coming up right behind Cruxton kind of helped ensure that what Cruxton did to Lytle took. Okay. Brock Field. Look at the ground sloping down there to your right towards the tree line. Okay? Actually ran through the eastern part of the Brock Field. The Brock Field continued over here. Notice how the ground is rising up once again.
So they really kind of deployed from the military crest.
The Union line, or who? Yes. Yeah. The Union line is in a lot of ways on the military crest of that slope in the Brock Field. Yeah. But the ground continues to slope down in their front, some distance into the woods, and then the ground rises up again, and the Confederates have got to attack over this crest, down that slope, and then into the field.
Makes more sense.
Yeah.
So the Tennessee monuments mark the furthest advance
The furthest
point?
advance, yes.
How far east past this water did the field?
I'll show you in just a minute.
Okay.
The eastern edge of the Brock Field is somewhere right along in here. I'll try to show you that more specifically in just a moment. See if I can do this without losing too much time.
Yellow, blue, and there's something else on the left.
Many of you all have probably driven past here many times and said, gee, this looks kind of silly. This cannon's just pointing into the woods. What's it doing sitting here? What's it actually pointing into? Brock Field. It is in the woods, but there's only a little bit of woods before the field opens up. This cannon actually is positioned here, representing part of Smith's Mississippi battery to fire into that field.
That's good. Yeah. It doesn't hurt my feelings.
To your left, and it's got still a little bit of an angle to it here, but now it's running more due south. This trail basically runs along the edge of the Brock Field. And if you move around a little bit, you can see the plastic trash bag I put on the tree over there on the side of the road. This is about the edge of the field. Still being careful of your footing. Look a little bit to your right and your right front, and you might be able to sense that the trees get thinner Well, that's because we're getting closer to the edge of the Brock Field. In the wintertime, when the vegetation is off of the trees, you can actually see Brock Field. In fact, I actually just found a place right here where the sun is lighting up Brock Field enough, and it's thin enough you can see Brock Field, what is today Brock Field. But you'd still be in the edge of historic Brock Field here. So the field was that much larger. Three-man who had to lean in and keep the vent closed, they could carry the round up, put it in, ram it home, and then as soon as they were ready to fire, they'd halt long enough to fire, and then they could repeat that process.
What sort of distance would they do that?
Well, there are some examples in the Civil War of withdrawing by prolong over 400 yards or 600 yards. So, but to do that, that means the enemy infantry must be awful close, and the enemy infantry is likely to be able to be putting fire onto your horses, there are a couple of there's a famous incident in the Battle of Gettysburg where that Massachusetts battery on the Trossel Farm, the famous photographs of all the dead horses around the Trossel Farm buildings, Bigelow's battery, they were withdrawing by prolong. And part of the reason that they have so many horse casualties is that they were doing that. But that's a calculation that an officer would have to make. Is it worth potentially expending the lives of those animals and crew members to keep that gun firing for a few minutes more?
And are there many examples of batteries firing by being manhandled forward as well?
No, there are not too many examples of guns being in battery, firing, and then being moved forward by hand, firing again, move forward by hand, firing again. There are not too many examples of those. Typically what they hoped was that the artillery fire would be sufficient to ensure overall success, and then the battery could simply limber up and move forward to the next potential firing position. I brought you down here to the position of Scott's Tennessee Battery because they too are on the edge of the Brock Field, the larger historic Brock Field. I also did that because if you want to touch a piece of the true cross from the Battle of Chickamauga, this is it right here. The National Military Park has got 256 artillery pieces in the collection. Only one of them do we know was actually in the battle, and that is this piece right here. We don't know which battery used it. We don't even know which side used it. But in the aftermath of the battle, Captain O.T. Gibbs, a Confederate ordnance officer, gives a statement of captured stores taken at the Battle of Chickamauga and received at Ringgold, Georgia for shipment south to the Atlanta Arsenal. And on that list is 12-pound bronze howitzer and carriage, number 186, CA and Company, C. Ames and Company, Boston, Massachusetts, and that is this gun. Whether it was a Union gun captured somewhere else earlier in the war, used in Confederate hands and replaced with a better gun as a result of the captures on this battlefield, whether it is a Union gun captured by the Confederates in this battle, but because it's just a 12-pound field howitzer, not put to use by the Confederates, we don't know. But it does appear on the in the official records on the list of captured stores sent south from the battlefield here. The Confederates will capture a number of better guns in this battle and put those guns to use in their artillery complements. And this list also includes a number of obvious Confederate manufactured guns which are now being sent to the rear since that battery had captured some better guns, including 2 iron 3-inch rifles produced by Noble Brothers and Company in Rome, Georgia. So that battery had been able to capture better, or been able to put to use better guns captured on the battlefield, and they almost certainly come from Bledsoe's Missouri battles.
You have a nickname for the piece?
I'm sorry?
You guys have a nickname for the piece?
No.
How did it make it from the war to being back up here? Back here?
We don't know. It survived Confederate hands because by this time of the war, the Confederates are able to produce 12-pound Napoleons in Augusta, Macon, and Columbus. And one of the things that they are doing is they are sending some of the older, more outdated, obsolete type arms, particularly the 6-pound guns and the rifle James guns. They're sending those to Augusta, Macon, or Columbus to be melted down, to be cast into 12-pound Napoleons. From 3 6-pound guns or 3 6-pound guns and James rifle combinations, you can cast 2 12-pound Napoleons. And the 12-pound Napoleon has longer range, throws a better chunk of metal down range as the standard artillery of the Civil War period. And so with the Confederates having achieved the ability to produce 12-pound Napoleons at those 3 places in particular, they are turning some of their older obsolete 6-pound guns into 12-pound Napoleons. And they're doing some howitzers as well, so this gun survived that, which would suggest that perhaps it was put into use by the Confederates eventually at some point. Then at the end of the war, came back into Union hands, put into storage, and wound up here. Now, we undoubtedly probably have in that 256 some other cannon that were here at the Battle of Chickamauga. The records just don't survive to show that they were actually here. We had a 12-pound Napoleon, which was almost certainly here at the Battle of Chickamauga and the battles for Chattanooga. But the gun is the one that was captured in a George Bernard photograph outside of Atlanta in September of 1864, the famous image of a fortification with an embrasure and the muzzle of a 12-pound Napoleon's sticking out of the muzzle. On a real clear copy of that picture, you could read the muzzle numbers. And that tube was at the Bragg Reservation. And when Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield Park was preparing its new exhibits, now almost 20 years ago, they wanted to trade. I won't tell the story about what I almost got in trade for it, but and why there's a guy with an AR-15 that follows me around when I go to Kennesaw these days. We traded that gun because it's such an iconic piece of the Atlanta campaign in that photograph. But almost certainly that gun was here as well. But it's not even known for certain which battery it was in 1864. Unfortunately, most of the guns we don't know their specific histories.
And that's not unique to this battlefield. That's the case on Gettysburg, Vicksburg. The Union Army, U.S. Army didn't preserve ordnance records that lets you identify what unit a tube was issued to.
One of the things I should make note of, that story I told you about Cheatham's brother John, the ordnance officer, and sending the wagons forward to recover dropped arms. I'm able to tell that story because he wrote an ordnance report after the battle, and it survived. It's published in the official records. In fact, all of the brigade ordnance reports for Cheatham's division survive and are published in the official records. There's some of the few like this from the Civil War on the Confederate side that survive at all, and they give us some idea of the ordnance expenditures and operations in Preston Smith's brigade that fought in Brock Field, and they'll fight a little bit on the night of the 20th, a little bit, or night of the 19th, a little bit on the 20th. The 154th and 13th Tennessee regiments consolidated, expended 10,338 rounds of ammunition. The 12th and 47th Tennessee regiments consolidated, expended 14,350 rounds of ammunition. The 11th Tennessee Regiment expended 4,320 rounds of ammunition. The 29th Tennessee Regiment expended 10,600 rounds of ammunition. That one brigade expended 39,609 rounds of ammunition.
What was the strength of the brigade?
It's about 1,400. Overall in battle, about 5 million rounds of small arms ammunition are fired.
And at this point in the war, where was that coming from in the South?
Well, the Confederates have established arsenals at Augusta, Macon, Atlanta, Columbus, Montgomery, and Selma, and most of that ammunition is being produced there. A lot of the labor in the production of that ammunition, taking a wooden form, rolling a trapezoidal sheet of paper around that form, twisting the end, tying that end off with a little piece of cotton cord, picking up a lead mini ball, placing that against the twisted end of that paper tube, which means that you couldn't twist too much paper. You had to twist just enough so you could tie it, but not too much, that it wouldn't go up into the cone of the bullet. Place the bullet against there, roll those two up in another trapezoidal piece of paper, twist the end of it, tie it with a small piece of cotton cord, withdraw the former, and put it in a box. A lot of that labor was done by women, girls, and young boys. And you had to make 900 a day in a 10-hour day. That's 90 an hour. That's 45 seconds to do what I just described to you. Roll two trapezoidal pieces of paper around a wooden form, twist the end of it, tie two pieces of cotton cord with a knot, including wrapping that lead ball up in one. And then, once those boxes of paper tubes with the lead balls were full, they were then sent to another part of the arsenal where employees who could be trusted okay. We identified what's the workforce of rolling them. Women, girls, and young boys. But in the part of the arsenal where you needed a workforce that could be trusted, it was men. Yep. Well, that's their idea, not mine. The men would put the powder charge in the tube and then fold the end of it together in a particular fashion. And fold the tail down. So then 10 of them would be packed together and packed in boxes.
How many did you say that was supposed to do with that?
900 a day in a 10-hour day. So that works out to 90 an hour.
And quantity used here?
The Confederates expend about 2.5 million rounds of ammunition in this battle. So 2,500 1,000-round boxes of ammunition. Overall expenditure of small arms ammunition in this battle is 5 million rounds. There are 34,000 casualties. About 4,000 dead outright, 25,000 wounded, and then the captured get to be more difficult because some of the captured are also wounded. And it is not always clear whether they are counted only once or twice. At a minimum, say 30,000 soldiers who were injured.
Whereas that was 34,000
Right.
So what's the hit ratio?
It's
It's a really small number.
yes. And there are multiple reasons for that, which manifest themselves here in a number of counts that describe the trees being stripped of their bark from the ground to 40 feet in the air. How many bullets that hit a tree this high or higher had any chance of doing any damage to a soldier?
What did the Wilder get?
We do not have ordnance returns for Wilder's Brigade of Mounted Infantry. But we also do not have any complaints by any of Wilder's men about running short on ammunition. In large measure because Wilder recognized that if you give an 18 to 25-year-old male a gun that shoots 3 to 4 times as fast as the standard gun, he's probably going to shoot 3 to 4 times as fast. So in addition to the 42 rounds that were carried in the cartridge box that was issued with the Spencer rifle, Wilder ordered each man to get a nose bag, extra nose bag for their animal, and in that carry 200 additional rounds of ammunition. Plus, he had a pack mule train to shuttle or to carry packing boxes of ammunition right along with the troops so that when needed they could be broken open and distributed. And then, as mules became empty pack mules could be sent back to wherever the wagons were to pick up and bring forward more boxes. Did he order the creation of the pack mule train on the night of the 17th of September when he took position at Alexander Bridge? Nope. That was something he'd done back in May and June as he first issued the Spencer repeating rifle. Being an industrialist, technologist, he recognized this new piece of technology and said, what's it going to take to make this effective? And a good supply of ammunition is one of those things, and so he took steps to ensure that his men never ran short of ammunition.
Did the people who did all that rolling of the ammunition, did they get a lunch break or anything?
Well, that's a good question, but the only description is that in a 10-hour day they had to do 900. Hopefully in the little look that I gave you of another part of the battle here, you learned something about, if not the battle itself, maybe something about the battlefield as it is today. But I do appreciate your coming out and participating in this program, and I hope that you will continue to visit on your own and study on your own. There's almost no end of what you can learn by tramping around out here and following individual units or phases of the battle. So, I've got one more today at 7 o'clock down at the Vineyard Field area. Be looking primarily at Eli Lilly's 18th Indiana Battery in that part of the fighting, and so we will park along Glen Vineyard Road and then walk along that wood line. So go down the Lafayette Road from the Visitor Center and then turn right on to Glen Vineyard Road, and I'll be there. We'll just park along Glen Vineyard Road and walk from there. So again, I do have copies